Hello and welcome back to Through the Bible, where we are walking through the Bible, looking at the storyline of Scripture and how all of it points to Jesus. And so we're ending the book of Genesis today, talking about the story of Joseph. The story of Joseph is an amazing story of God's sovereignty over sin and suffering that brings about salvation. And so this story, it starts in Genesis chapter 37 and goes all the way to Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter in the book. Really, the last quarter of the book of Genesis is taken up with the story of Joseph. It is one of the longest narratives, the longest continuous narratives in the entire Bible. And we immediately see some issues as we get into the story of Joseph. But the issues begin not with Joseph, but with Joseph's dad, Jacob. Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. We looked at his story last time, and he had 12 sons. These are the 12 tribes of Israel that come from his 12 sons. And Jacob had a favoritism problem. Jacob had a favorite wife, and the oldest son of his favorite wife became his favorite son, Joseph. Jacob, he wasn't shy about this favoritism. Most parents, you know, if they do have a favorite child, which would not be a good thing, they would still say, well, I love you all equally, but just in slightly different ways. And so, but Joseph's dad, he didn't care. He said, no, Joseph's actually my favorite. And in fact, I'm going to give him a special gift to prove that he is my favorite child. And so naturally, Joseph, he gets a big head about this. He has his beautiful rainbow coat that his dad gave him to show that he's the favorite. And then Joseph starts having these dreams. And instead of keeping them to himself, arrogantly, he decides to share them with his entire family. He says, hey, I had a dream that all of you are going to bow down to me one day. And so the brothers, naturally, his 11 brothers, they don't like this. They are filled with jealousy. They are filled with hatred. And so when Joseph comes to check on them, at first, they want to kill him. But they decide they couldn't make any money off of him if they kill him, so they are going to sell him into slavery instead. And so here's what they do when Joseph comes to visit them in Genesis 37, verses 23 and 24. It says, when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. And they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And then after that, they sit down for a meal callously. In the word there for stripped, the Hebrew word refers to the skinning of an animal. That's typically the context that it's used. And when it says they threw him into a pit, that refers to the dumping of a dead body. And so this was a violent act that they committed against their own brother. And so Joseph gets brought to Egypt. He's brought into the household of a very prominent Egyptian official, a guy named Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife sees Joseph, is attracted to Joseph, and starts coming on to him. Joseph resists. He flees sexual temptation, but still is accused of sexual assault and gets thrown into prison. So the other prisoners that he's there with, they have some dreams. Joseph interprets their dreams, and when one of them gets restored to his position in Pharaoh's household, Joseph says, please remember me when you go back to Pharaoh's household. Naturally, he forgets, and Joseph is stuck in an Egyptian prison, hopeless, no chance of parole, no chance of release. He's down there in that pit for 2 more years. But God still has a plan through all of this. God is not done with Joseph. God is not done with Joseph's family, and God is not even done with Egypt. So Pharaoh has a dream, and the guy who's in prison with Joseph remembers, wait a second, there was a guy who I knew who could interpret dreams. And so Joseph gets brought up out of prison, restored, interprets Pharaoh's dreams that there's going to be this massive drought and famine that's going to come to the land of Egypt. And so Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command of all of Egypt over everything except the crown, everything except the throne of Pharaoh himself. And so this guy who was in an Egyptian prison rotting away just a short time before is now the prince of Egypt, second in command only to Pharaoh himself. And so Just as Joseph predicted, just as these dreams predicted that God gave to Pharaoh, this famine does strike, but they are prepared, and Joseph is in the spot where he can save many lives, both the Egyptians and even his own family. Joseph's dreams come true. His family comes to Egypt, bows down before the second in command of Pharaoh. At this point, they didn't even know that it was Joseph. Joseph reveals himself to them, and they are reunited once again. So what do we learn from this story of Joseph? As we said in the beginning, we see that God is sovereign over three things: sin, suffering, and salvation. Sovereign over sin, suffering, and salvation. It was sinful for Jacob to show favoritism to his son Joseph. It was sinful for Joseph in his arrogance to lord his dreams and these prophetic visions over his brothers as a way of gaining power over them. And it was certainly sinful for Joseph's brothers to beat him and to sell him into slavery and to lie to their dad about his death. It was sinful for Potiphar's wife to come onto him and then falsely accuse him of sexual assault. But God uses even those sins, and God uses the suffering that Joseph experiences from them to save not just his own family, but to save countless lives. In Genesis chapter 50, one of the most famous verses in the book of Genesis, this is what we read. Joseph's dad dies, the brother's father dies, Jacob, and they come to Joseph and they say, "Hey, before dad died, he told us that you can't hurt us or do anything to us," which is not really what he said, but they say that anyways. And look at Joseph's gracious response to his brothers. Joseph has completely forgiven them, and this is how he phrases it. He says, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." There was a salvation that was brought about through the evil that was intended for Joseph. And note, this is not just a physical salvation, not just the salvation of food, but think about the family situation that Joseph, his brothers, and their father were in. Joseph was full of arrogance. Jacob was full of favoritism. Their brothers were full of hatred and jealousy. It was tearing this family apart. This family could have collapsed from the inside out because of these things that existed in their hearts. But God saved this family, saved Israel and the future of Israel, not just physically, but spiritually as well. How did he do it? Through suffering. God took what was meant for evil and used it for good. This reminds us of the beautiful promise in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It says that God uses all things for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. That is true for you who love God and are called according to his purpose. How do we know that that promise is true? We know that it's true because of Jesus. At the cross, the ultimate act of evil was committed, the killing of God himself, the murder of God's Son, the unjust accusation against Jesus himself. Jesus was thrown into a pit and left for dead. Jesus was falsely accused. Jesus was stripped. Jesus was beaten, and not just left for dead, but actually died. And still, God was able to use that ultimate evil to bring about the saving of many lives.